for my first master's, I was looking at the genes related to a plant's ability to hyperaccumulate heavy metals, and specifically cadmium and zinc in its leaves. And the long-term idea of this research was, okay, you've got this plant that takes a lot of metals out of the ground. Can we transfer those genes into a really large plant, maybe a freaking tree? And that way we would have this green technology where we can take all these heavy metals out of the ground and remediate the area versus other conventional methods of doing that. The goal wasn't to hurt or harm people. Yes, I was looking at this idea of potentially genetic engineering, but it wasn't to hurt or harm people. It wasn't trying to reduce ecological diversity. It wasn't to make millions of dollars. And I think there's always this kind of mainstream narrative that the assumption is the people behind these biotech crops are all just some part of conspiracy theory to control us or harm us or kill us. I think it's always worth reminding people that every field has bad actors, and then every field also has people that are generally trying to drive positive change. And the same thing is true here.
Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm joined by E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thanks so much for tuning into the show this week. Hello, how are you, E.C.?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm excited to get into this conversation. We've got a conversation around the world of GMOs. For those folks who don't know, genetically modified organisms. We're going to discuss what they are, the labeling requirements, their prevalence in crops, public perception, potential risks and benefits, and the regulations surrounding GMO development. But first, want to remind you about the 800-gram challenge ebook. You hear us talking about the 800-gram challenge on the show all of the time. Here's a super simple version. Eat 800 grams by weight of the fruits and veg of your choice per day. Continue to eat whatever else you want. Still no restrictions, just additions. That's a great start. But if you want to understand EC's prescription even deeper, our suggestion is that you start with the 800-gram challenge ebook. It's where EC has collected all the best advice to follow, practical tips for getting started and eating out, as well as some of the pitfalls to look out for. Find it at optimizemenutrition.com/800G challenge. Just tap the link in the show notes. We'll get you there. It's also on that page. There's a whole bunch of information as to what the 800-gram challenge is if you happen to be new here. Okay, my friend. GMOs. What the heck do we need to know about GMOs so that we can enter into this conversation?
Really easy topic. Should be done in 1-2 minutes.
Super simple. Yeah. Not controversial at all.
Not controversial. Should be an easy one. GMO, as you mentioned, stands for genetically modified organism. And for this podcast, we are just talking about plants. We're not even going to attempt the ethics here on animals or even the ethics around plants. We're just not even going to go there. We're talking how these might overlap with nutrition. And the reason that they might overlap with nutrition, I actually just got a recent question. Somebody sent me their label from the mayonnaise jar, and it indicates that the ingredients come from a bioengineered source. So ultimately, what the heck is that? But that ultimately leads to what the heck are GMOs? And what's really interesting, we talk about definitions all the time, but I think more so than every episode that we've done, the crux of the whole issue here is what the heck do we mean when we say GMOs? And I think when people hear that, they have, it's just a black and white cut and dry definition. And really it's going to be highly, highly nuanced on what it means to be a GMO. So when we look at genetic engineering, it says biotechnology technique that will directly manipulate an organism's DNA. And they could end up creating what's known as recombinant DNA. And it's exactly what it sounds like. You're combining DNA from multiple sources. And so there have been genetic engineering of crops where they take a gene from, let's say, an unrelated species, bacteria, virus, or fungi, or something like that, and then insert it into a plant crop. And the genetic engineering of animals and plants started in the 1970s, but really came more into the mainstream in the 90s. And the organism that results from this recombinant DNA is known as the GMO, the genetically modified organism. And the food that might result from that could be called GM or genetically modified. And these terms are kind of interchangeable. We also now have this word bioengineered. I just mentioned that somebody said, hey, that was on my label. That's, as far as I know, it's just a US term. This label became a federal rule at the end of 2023. And so they're really going to be looking for compliance by 2025. And so these foods have to disclose whether or not they have bioengineered ingredients. And the recombinant DNA example that I gave, inserting, let's say, a bacterial gene into corn, that would be considered bioengineered. But the definition for bioengineered in the US is that it applies to foods that contain detectable genetic material for which the modification could not otherwise be obtained through conventional breeding or found in nature. And again, I think we're going to see that sounds really straightforward. It's becoming less and less straightforward what that really means.
The term bioengineered, is that, you said it looked like it was just in the US. Is that in replacement of GMO on labeling, or has GMO ever been on labels? I actually don't know that answer.
There's actually a project, and I don't know the organization that's leading it, but they'll do kind of certification of foods. It's almost like you've probably seen, this is a zone diet protein bar, something like that. So you can go find foods that are going to be like the non-GMO project verified. So it has been on foods. It's not necessarily been a government regulation. But as far as I understand, and I would have to go back and double check on this, but I think I remember reading that the word bioengineered was very specifically chosen because there's such a negative connotation around GMOs and genetically modified. I think we're going to get into some of that in a little bit. But I think there's such a negative public perception around that, is that they wanted to use a new term to prevent some of the backlash. Although essentially we're getting after the same similar concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, so it feels like somebody said, you guys are going to have to put GMOs on the label. And they're like, no, we're going to put this other term. Okay, that's the compromise. Okay, got it. Can you give us a sense of how widespread are GMOs? You said they really started to come out in the 70s and then really the 90s.
90s, yeah.
Like, are we talking about like everything, or are we talking about just a little bit?
Yeah. I think I don't know what actually the public perception is, but I think they might be more widely used than people expect. According to the Turnbull paper in the show notes, there has been more than 100-fold increase in GMO crop production in the last 25 years, so since about 1990. So even though they came into play in the 90s, really have still seen a significant growth since then. In total, there's 190 million hectares of biotech crops, which that would basically cover the entire surface of Mexico. That's a pretty big area. Soybean, maize, cotton, and canola. Those represent the four primary cultivated crops that use bioengineered methods. And this is something that I actually also don't think people really know, is that most of the products that have been genetically modified don't actually go directly to human consumption. So a lot of the crops that have been through genetic modification might be used for animal feed, let's say, or maybe, with maize that's been genetically modified, it might be used for ethanol production. And then about 1/10 of our genetically modified, maize actually goes to food. So the US is definitely the dominant player and considered to be the global leader in the market, holding close to 30% of the market for agricultural biotech. And the US accounts for more than half of the farmland used to grow GMOs. So again, I think it's probably more widespread than people realize.
Super interesting. This is outside the scope of this conversation, but I can't help but think, I wonder what the rise of artificial intelligence may do to the rise of genetically modified organisms.
I actually think it could be positive. At first, when you say that, I know it becomes this really oh gosh, we're entering this, whatever, this avatar universe, or I don't know what it is. But I hopefully I'm going to give people some hope that this isn't all doom and gloom.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so speaking of, where does the fear come from around GMOs? Obviously, I've never heard anybody say GMOs are amazing.
Right.
So what's the source of whether it's fear or skepticism or whatever?
Yeah, there are some legitimate concerns, which we're going to touch on. But I think just the main ultimate concern is sort of what you were hinting at. It's just like this Frankenstein science, this altered reality, mixing in the gene pool, which wouldn't have already happened naturally. And so we're back to that pesky word natural. I mean, maybe after dose, this podcast should be called nature or something. I don't know. But, that word natural is really misleading. It has become synonymous with good or better or safe, yet there are plenty of natural things that are deadly, poisonous mushrooms, lots of them. Natural snakes, not safe, weather, I mean, gosh, we can be here all day talking about natural things that are dangerous. But I think where people fail to realize about GMOs is that before we were necessarily doing this science in, let's say, the lab with our white coats on and doing all that stuff, that humans have been manipulating crops in very unnatural ways for a long, long time. We have been playing around with genomes for a while. So the crops that we go to buy in the supermarket, they've been selectively bred for centuries based on the characteristics like sweetness or pest resistance or shorter growing seasons. And they've been doing this over centuries because that's how we create more robust crops or crops that we actually like to eat. And so what will happen at the end of the growing season, they're like, wow, that one really produced a lot of fruit, or that one was able to withstand the drought. So we're going to save the seeds and then we're going to cross that with the plant that grew, I don't know, with this type of pest or something like that. And so we didn't really let natural selection take its course with the foods that we were consuming now, right? We, the humans, drove the selection in the future generation of the crops. So you need to kind of keep that in mind, because I think people think, oh gosh, my tomatoes are natural. It's like, not really. That's a stretch, right? I'm also guessing that people probably don't know this. I certainly actually didn't know this until I was looking into it. There's something that's called mutation breeding that's been occurring since 1930. And so this is where they will take seeds and they'll expose the seeds to, let's say, chemicals or even radiation to cause a mutation that hopefully has desirable traits. And so between 1930 and 2014, there's been more than 3,000 mutagenic plant varieties and more than 240 species that have been released. And we're not actually sure of how many still exist today, because it's really hard to track on that. And it's kind of before this genetic engineering evolution came to be. And so really the next step after kind of the selective breeding over centuries to then mutation breeding, now we're kind of into this evolution of genetic engineering. And what's different now is, yes, we're doing it in the lab and people can think about kind of the Frankenstein science, I guess. But what's actually really great about this approach is we now have the ability to target one gene and one gene only. And it's through this powerful technique called gene editing. And so instead of, let's say, taking a gene out of bacteria and putting it in corn, we can just go within corn and we can edit those genes. And it could be where I kind of like using the analogy I saw in one of the papers. Like, think about if you're editing a Word document and you might do copy paste and you might do delete. You can essentially do that within a genome, and you might be able to make the corn more resistant to drought, or again, more resistant to pests, or it might be sweeter, or it might grow bigger ears, or whatever it is, right? And so now you have a product that's been done through these genetic engineering techniques, but it might still only contain its own DNA. So we might have manipulated the DNA, done this scary science stuff, but technically created a better product, and a product that potentially could have happened naturally because it only contains its own DNA. Right? And so this is where it gets to the $1 million question, right? Is this a genetically modified organism? If this could have happened naturally and we're not manipulating genomes from different species, and it looks very similar to what we would do with traditional breeding techniques, does this get a bioengineered label? And so we'll talk a little bit more on the regulatory process, but right now in the US, basically when we do this gene editing technique, again, the copy, delete, paste type of stuff, they're not considered GMOs and would not get the bioengineered label. Because what they found is that they've come up, by doing stuff in the lab, they've been able to come up with the same species that they can also find out in nature. So how in the heck are you going to regulate those differently if, gosh, what we did in the lab, we also can find in nature? And so they are indistinguishable, which really comes back to that definition that I said. Now, again, people freak out with this more Frankenstein science, this more modern day science. But what's also interesting about this, when we control one gene and one gene only, we have better control of the outcome. What people don't realize is, when you combine two plants, just as we were doing with the old breeding techniques, the whole genome gets mixed up. And you don't necessarily know what you're going to get at the end result. It's very different now with gene editing because we have a much more targeted control that we're not messing up the whole genome. We're going in and we're just making these selective edits. And so I think a lot of this fear is, again, just not really understanding the science around gene editing. And it's very hard to do. We can't all have PhDs in genetics. Even reading these papers, some of the stuff I could not keep up with the techniques at all. And so we find that really the people that are the most afraid, and this is actually in the Walt and Walt paper in the show notes, but the people that are most afraid of it are actually more of the lay people. And then when we look at the scientists, are you afraid of GMOs? We find that they don't find much fear at all. So I think there's just a lot of public hesitation, and rightfully so, because it's a really complex topic and it's hard to convey what we're doing with gene editing and why it actually might be better than some of the historic methods we've already been doing to manipulate the plant genomes.
Okay, given that you did mention legitimate concerns, what would those be, or what are those?
Yeah. So the main concern from human health is that when we mix up these genes, we don't know if a new protein is going to be produced. And then a new protein could result in an allergen, or it could result in a toxin. And so those are dangerous. I mean, allergies can be deadly immediately, right? And toxins obviously as well. And again, that risk is still there when we look at conventional breeding. So people think that it's only going to happen when we do stuff in the lab, but no, we actually still have that risk when we do breeding. And I think a great kind of analogy is just think about kids. Like, yes, your kids have tendencies to have your genes, but I'm sure there's been plenty of examples where kids don't actually have the same health conditions or diseases as their parents, and vice versa. You don't totally know what you're going to get. And the same thing is true happening with our conventional breeding. So yes, we don't know if there's going to be a new protein produced that's a problem, but we also don't know that if that's going to happen in the older techniques. We have found that they are safe. So there is broad scientific consensus that they're safe, even though there is this risk. And so from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also the American Medical Association, also the WHO, the World Health Organization, also the FAO, or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, have found no adverse human health effects related to GMO food that's been reported in the peer literature to date. And these crops, as we've said, have been used for 25 plus years at this point. So yes, there's this concern about, oh gosh, are we creating a new problematic protein? But it hasn't borne out yet in the literature. There is also this concern about antibiotic resistance, that GMOs might promote more antibiotic resistance, and that because maybe in some of the techniques that they use, they might introduce a gene into these genetically modified organisms, and therefore that might be, let's say, a gene that helps a plant stay more resistant to pests. But then when we consume that plant, that maybe our bacteria in our stomach get exposed to that, and so they develop antibiotic resistance. Yes, that is a concern, but we believe that risk to be smaller than what we find people already develop antibiotic resistance to, in the sense that we find that people overuse antibiotics to a vast scale already, that is a topic that we need to tackle. Like, hey, let's not go get antibiotics if you don't need them, versus necessarily worrying about antibiotic resistance developing from GMOs. And there are also then environmental concerns. Basically, do these genes inadvertently get transferred to nearby crops? Maybe we manipulated corn, but what happens to the crops next to the corn? Does this result in some lack of biodiversity? And what are the ramifications of that on the ecosystem? And so, yeah, I think those are some of the big concerns. I will say that, we have a lot of regulation in place to be looking out for what happens to human health and what happens to these products before going to market in some cases, and what's happening to the environment. That's where the EPA steps in, such that, I don't want to say that these are without risk entirely, but we also have some safeguards in place and are aware that these could be potentially negative outcomes.
Why do you think, or why, as you're reading through these papers, why is there this interest to continue to develop GMOs or crops with genetic editing, given all the, given those risks, given the questions, given maybe the skepticism?
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of said at the beginning, right? Like, you don't think you've seen a lot of pro GMO stuff in the lay press. Not a lot of people
and yet
are.
The scientists who are working on it are like, this is it. This is
the next thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we hear a lot about the positives. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the positives, because there are people that are looking into the GMOs for truly altruistic reasons, or gene editing, as we've said. I think I've mentioned this before, but it's probably been a while, that for my first master's, I was looking at the genes related to a plant's ability to hyperaccumulate heavy metals, and specifically cadmium and zinc, in its leaves. And the long-term idea of this research was, okay, we've got this plant that takes a lot of metals out of the ground. Can we transfer those genes into a really large plant, maybe a freaking tree? And that way we would have this green technology where we can take all these heavy metals out of the ground and remediate the area versus other conventional methods of doing that. And so the goal wasn't to hurt or harm people. Yes, I was looking at this idea of potentially genetic engineering, but it wasn't to hurt or harm people. It wasn't trying to reduce ecological diversity. It wasn't to make millions of dollars. And I think there's always this kind of mainstream narrative that the assumption is the people behind these biotech crops are all just some part of conspiracy theory to control us or harm us or kill us. And, I think it's always worth reminding people that every field has bad actors. And then every field also has people that are generally trying to drive positive change. And the same thing is true here. And so some of the good examples that I want to remind people of, we actually talked about this way back in the animal versus plant-based episode, but it's this product called golden rice, which is a genetic engineered version of rice to contain vitamin A. And so rice provides 30, but upwards of 72% of the energy intake for people in Asia, and it doesn't have vitamin A naturally. And so vitamin A deficiency kills 670,000 children every year under the age of 5. And supposedly, we had anti-GMO activists destroy fields of golden rice that was going through some field trials back in the Philippines in 2013 because they were against this idea of genetic engineering, right? And so they destroyed these fields that were trying to test out this crop. And so acceptance has been really hard because of this anti-GMO movement. And this stuff really drives me nuts when you think about the fact that maybe now we can give people through the foods that they rely on for sustenance to protect them against deficiency and child death. It just gets so maddening. And it's like, oh my gosh, this stuff has been promoted so negatively, but look at this positive upside that we could have had. Another really positive push for GMOs is how to deal with kind of world hunger as our population continues to expand. I've seen estimates that we're going to reach 9 billion people by 2050, and an additional 70% of the food supply is needed above and beyond what we have now. Additional 70%, that's a lot. And so part of the reasons why GMOs can help here is that when we're able to produce crops with more yield or be more pest resistant, we therefore don't need as many inputs. We can lower the costs, all of that stuff. And even GMOs could be a net win for the environment, which I think is probably surprising for people to hear, but there's something like BT corn where they basically insert a pest-resistant gene into corn. And guess what? Maybe you actually get to cut back on pesticide use because now the corn is more, quote, naturally resistant to it than having to spray all these pesticides. And even they've found that BT rice, so the same idea, take a bacterial gene, insert into rice, they've found that that rice can survive longer in flooded conditions. 14 days versus 3 days, which you might be like, okay, why is that good? Well, in Bangladesh and India, they lose roughly 4 million tons of rice to flooding every year, which is enough to feed 30 million people. And so, especially with climate change and stuff like that, maybe we can come up with crops that are going to be able to handle these more erratic weather conditions. So I think there's a lot of potential here and a lot of different avenues that we don't really hear as much in the mainstream media. I'd like to point out that there's also people on the anti-GMO movement that are getting richer. And I kind of already hinted at this when I said that there's this non-GMO project Verified where products will get a label that says, hey, we don't have any GMOs. Well, the non-GMO certified market has increased more than 70-fold since 2010, from 350 million to 26 billion by 2018. So, I just like to point out that everybody thinks that it's just the corporate giants making money. Well, some of the corporate giants are the people that are against the advancement of the technology, right? Sort of ironic there. So anyway, I think we always need to be cautious about a new technology, but like many of the controversial topics that we've talked about before, this dichotomous thinking of good or bad is probably not the way to approach it. And that we have to always think that there's going to be a risk-benefit trade-off and evaluate that risk-benefit trade-off before we kind of, draw our line on the sand, on our opinion.
Yeah. You mentioned regulation in GMO development, and I always like when you bring this up. Can you talk a little bit about the process through which products or these things do actually, in fact, get to whether it's our kitchen or the farm?
Probably going to be a little more US centric here. But there is a difference in how countries regulate it. Basically, some countries decide to regulate it based on the process they use to create the crop. So were you in a lab, manipulating the DNA, or was this thing grown out in the field? That would be a process related regulation. And then there's also countries that look at the final product. They're like, we don't care how you got there, but what is the end result? And then we're going to regulate that final product. So the US falls in the latter in the product approach, which I'm not trying to be biased here, but that's sort of my opinion. Like, we got to look at the final thing. If we ended up producing something that was that's also found in nature, I don't know that we needs to be regulated any differently, right? So when I talked about those gene editing techniques, about when we come up with a product that is indistinguishable from what we found in nature, those are not actually regulated separately in the US. And so those can just go to market, so to speak, as the natural crop would. If you buy something that's labeled organic in the market, it doesn't specifically say non-GMO on it, but as part of being organic, it will not have genetic engineering techniques in the products that you purchase. For our non-organic products in the US, the product then, the end result, is going to be, no surprise, regulated by our agencies, the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA, to make sure, okay, are human risks looked at? Are animal risks looked at? Or is the environment risk looked at? And another avenue that is available to make sure that it's safe is the FDA actually has a voluntary plant biotechnology consultation program. And this is basically where a big corporate company would come in and they say, okay, we've got this crop that we want to put out there. Let's work with the FDA and make sure that it's going to meet all those certification standards or whatever, meet all the health standards, and make sure that it's safe. And the criticism of this is, okay, they're probably just in bed with the FDA, but I would counter and push back and say that, no, they actually just want to make sure that they've minimized their risk and liability. That yes, corporate giants want to make money, but they also want to make sure they don't have to spend a lot in lawsuits. So that's currently the status of the regulations in the US. There is a lot of regulations in place. And I think, again, more than probably people think would be there just originally when they hear about the fears around GMOs. But something that I also want to point out about regulations and the unintended consequences of regulations, it really reminds me of my farming days in Montana, which we've mentioned a few times. But basically, I took a break from the real world and went out to a CSA farm near Glacier National Park and worked on a summer. And the farm in practice was 100% organic. We did not spray anything. We also ran off of solar power. They were paying me and the other farm hands to basically pick grubs out of the ground so that we didn't have to spray thing and do all the weeding manually and all of this stuff. We were in practice 100% organic, but the farm itself and the foods that we sold did not have the organic label. And the reason was the cost to get that labeling was more than the entire annual profit for the farm. And so, I kind of mentioned that some of these newer gene editing techniques don't have the regulation. And I think that makes people a little bit skeptical and fearful and all of that stuff. But I think you have to remember that sometimes while more regulation sounds good, it also makes it harder for the more independent businesses to succeed. And that the cost to go through some of these processes can be tens of years and tens of millions of dollars to get a product certified. And so you sometimes have to wonder who are really hurting here. Maybe there could be a really great crop that actually produces more yield, but yet it can't come to market because we have to go through all of these different regulations. And so, again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any regulation, but I think there's always some nuance here that we have to really think about. More regulations isn't necessarily what we want here. We want to be kind of fixated on the end result product, evaluating the safety of it, the risk-benefit trade-off that I mentioned.
I think that's a good place to wrap up just that idea and that reminder of the nuance in this conversation that is so often, like a lot of things in nutrition, a lot of things we talk about, people really want it to be black, white, on, off, yes, no. But the truth is that once you talk to anybody who knows anything or you do a little bit of research, you realize, it's not that simple. It's not that easy. My opinion needs to be more nuanced if I want it to be anywhere near honest and useful.
Totally. Won't get as many clicks and won't get as many Netflix documentaries, but probably that's where the truth is.
Probably that's where the truth is. All right. Thank you, EC. One more reminder, folks out there, if you'd like to learn more about the 800 gram challenge, the 800 gram challenge ebook is simply the best way to do so. You can find the ebook at optimizemenutrition.com/800G challenge. Just tap the link in the show notes and you will get yourself there. Thank you, EC. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back next week for another episode of the Consistency Project podcast.